Photoshop. Yay, Photoshop. Some of you have been waiting for this. Since we have been working in Illustrator this entire time, we're moving into Photoshop, some of this may be a little confusing, and it's not going to be confusing just because we've been working with Illustrator first. But there are a lot of tools in Photoshop that are the same tools that we see in Illustrator, but there's a fundamental difference in the programs it's really important to go over. And the best way that I can start this is by going File, New. And when you see the File, New, you will see this dialog box. And in this dialog box, you're going to see width, height, and resolution to start with. And right now, I just have it set to an 8.5 by 11, which is just regular letter size piece of paper. But notice the resolution here, 300 pixels per inch. This is really important. And the reason why this is really important is because Photoshop is, unlike Illustrator, Photoshop is a pixel-based program. So the most important thing you can do from in Photoshop when you are starting a project is identify how big the piece that you're working on is going to end up being. Now sometimes that's kind of hard. Sometimes you don't know how big it's going to be, and you got to make a really good guess. But the reason for this is this right here. 300 pixels per inch is widely considered the standard at which a digital image becomes photographic. In other words, at 300 pixels per inch, at that point, or thereabouts, the pixels are now finally small enough and close enough together that you cannot actually see the individual pixels. Some people will tell you that 200 pixels per inch is enough. That's true for some people, but there are plenty of people who can see the pixels at 200 pixels per inch. They can actually see the little dots. So 300 is really the way to go. That's considered the standard, and if you're ever producing an image for a professional or whatever, if it's not 300 pixels per inch, it's not considered, technically at least, full quality. Okay? So that's the standard that we're going to work at right now, is 300 pixels per inch. And everything we do in this class for print is going to be at 300 pixels per inch. Now, the monitors that we have, okay, these monitors, even these great monitors that we have, are actually at this, 72 pixels per inch. Can anybody see a problem with viewing a 300 pixels per inch image on a 72 pixel per inch monitor? Just general problem with that?
You're going to run out of space.
Well, yes and no. You're right, you could run out of space, but we can zoom out in Photoshop, so that's not that big of a deal. But what happens if we zoom out in Photoshop? Can we actually tell if the image is really high quality or not? No. And that's the major problem, is that people will look at an image on the screen and think that it's sharp and think that it's a high quality image, but it's not, because our monitors are 72 pixels per inch and our prints need to be at 300. A good example of this, how many of you have ever seen a picture on the internet and it was really big in your browser and you hit print, and when it came out it was either really tiny, or if you made it bigger it looked pathetic? Does that happen to anybody here? Most of you, yeah, probably have seen that. This is because the screen is a low resolution output. We're not to the point yet where screens are measured in pixels per inch, really, unless you're talking about the iPhone. And I won't go too much into it, but I think that the iPhone could actually be, this whole new Retina display thing that they've had for the last couple of years, could actually be something really, really, really good for televisions and for computer monitors. I think that eventually we'll get to the point where we're measuring our computer monitors not in total number of pixels, 1080p, okay, just tells you the total number of pixels. Well, if you notice, you get a 55-inch TV, it still only has 1080 pixels tall. You get a 36-inch television that has 1,080 pixels tall. Well, guess what? If you walk up nose to nose on that 50-inch TV, you're going to see the pixels. Whereas if you put your nose up against the 36-inch TV, it's going to be a lot harder to see the pixels because they're smaller and closer together. I think we'll eventually get to the point where televisions will be measured in pixels per inch, just like our prints. But until we get there, okay, these monitors are essentially glorified HD TVs. We're going to realize that we're viewing something at 72 pixels per inch. And we want it at 300. So what this really comes down to is you have to trust your numbers. You can't trust the monitor all the time. When you're viewing your picture, especially at lower magnification, in other words, you can see the whole thing top to bottom, you really can't tell if it's a high quality image or not very well, unless you know it is because you've been following the numbers. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? It's kind of like saying the movie looked beautiful and yet you're looking at it with a 1960s color TV. The quality of that television is not going to be as good as what we're used to now. So if it looks beautiful on a 1960s TV, that's great, but will it look beautiful on a new television? How do you know? Well, you just got to wait until you look at it on a new TV, I guess, right? So anyway, when you're making your new file, that's the most important thing, is understanding what your size is going to be before you start. So if you're just going to be doing a regular letter size photograph, 8.5 by 11, 300 pixels per inch. You want to do something bigger? Fine. 11 by 17, 300 pixels per inch. So that's going to be our standard. Always, always, always 300 pixels per inch until we get to web design. And then we'll get into something else. But for all of our photographic work that we're designing for print, that's where we're going to be at. We are also always on RGB color for now. We may switch later, and we'll talk about CMYK color versus RGB color when we start doing color theory in about a week or so from now. And we're going to work with our background as transparent. I don't like solid colored backgrounds when I'm starting. Doesn't mean I don't put a solid color background in there eventually. I just like transparent background. Don't fool around with any of these, really, okay? You don't need to. Especially the pixel aspect ratio. I will always change the color profile to Adobe RGB myself, but that's really not that big of a deal for now, at least not for now. Again, once we start getting into colors more and learning a little bit more about color theory and what it means for computer graphics, then we can start talking about color profiles, but for now, no big deal. So I'm just going to hit OK. And there we go. There's our image. And you can see that it looks like a chessboard. This checkerboard that you're seeing here, okay, this is how Adobe Photoshop shows you that something is transparent. This is another important thing that you need to get through your head, is transparent is different than white. Now, if I were to print this out on a piece of paper right now, whatever is transparent is going to become white because that's my paper color. However, what if you were printing on a colored paper, like blue paper, and you needed white letters? Well, now you can have a transparent background and do white letters in Photoshop, and if you've got white ink, and that's the key, obviously, is you have to have white ink, but if you've got white ink, you can now have white letters. Do you see? On a colored paper. So transparent is not the same as white, even if that's how it might come out on a regular print because you're using white paper. So it's another important thing to kind of keep in your mind. Excuse me. If you just take a look out at look at the layout here, it's very similar to Illustrator, where we have tool options at the top. We've got a menu across the top. We've got our tools down along the left. We've got palettes that kind of pop up on the right here, and most prominently will be your Layers palette. And the Layers palette is one of the most important things in Photoshop. In Illustrator, it wasn't so important. In Photoshop, Layers palette is one of the most important things. And we'll talk about why in a second. You'll notice that over here we have shape tools just like we do in Illustrator. Okay? So I'm going to make a blue rectangle. You see the colors down here. By the way, there's no stroke color thing here like there is in Illustrator. If you want to put a stroke around something, you have to do it with the layers. I'll show you that later. Okay? And I'm just going to draw a shape. Now notice what happens to my Layers palette over here. I've got a shape and I've got a color. See that? And if I want to change the color of an object in Photoshop, I can double click it. Just double click that color piece, and there we go. Now I can shift the color. This is, by the way, a vector-based graphic. But don't get too confused. Now hold on just a second, because I want to illustrate something for you. Let's trash this. I need another layer before I can trash. You can always have to have one layer in an image. Okay. So I'm going to trash this. Let's go with circles. So I'm going to make a really tiny little circle here. Okay? There's a tiny little circle. And then I'm going to make another tiny little circle. Whoops, I wanted to do it on a different layer. So there's another tiny little circle. Okay. Now, I'm going to do something fancy to this circle, and that is I'm going to rasterize the layer. Okay? What that does is, notice it gets rid of the shape. This layer now, this circle here, is now a pixel-based layer. This layer here is now a vector-based layer. And before I do this experiment, to show you something, I'm also going to create a solid colored background just so that we can see. So I'm going to fill this whole background with white. So we just have a solid color. It'll be easier to see what I'm about to do. So now I'm going to take this shape number 1, and I'm going to scale it up. I'm going to go Edit, Transform, and Scale. And now as I scale it up, notice how the quality stays the same. Can you see that? Nice, smooth edge. The quality has stayed the same even though I've scaled it up. However, let's turn this layer off. If I take the pixel-based layer and I scale it up, watch what it looks like. Look at the edge. You see that? Now just for reference, let's turn on the other layer. See if it lets me turn on the other. It won't let me turn on the other layer. But you remember how smooth the other layer was. Okay? I just tried to enlarge a pixel-based layer. Here's the key that I want you to get out of this. There are two different types of objects in Photoshop. One is a vector-based layer. The other one is a pixel-based layer, or a rasterized layer. Same thing. Rasterized equals pixel-based. Same idea. You cannot scale pixel-based layers up. I can scale it down, because of course I can always make something smaller, but I can't scale them up. However, shape-based layers, shape layers, or vector-based layers, I can always scale them up or down with never having a loss of quality. However, both of those are limited by the resolution of the containing document. So if I make this document a 4x5 at 300 pixels per inch, and then I want to make it an 11x17, I will be printing at less than 150 pixels per inch. The quality is going to be pretty horrible. Okay? So the containing document, whatever you set that document as when you went File New, that dictates the overall resolution of the image, regardless of whether you used all vector-based layers or pixel-based layers. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing. Excuse me. So, having said that, once I try and apply this transformation, Photoshop's going to try and smooth it out for me a little bit. So let's take a look at this here. So if I hit the check mark, you see how it looks kind of blurry. See that? And if I turn on the other one, we'll go right here at the intersection between the two of them. Let's even change the color here of this so we can see it. Can you see how the edge of the red one is nice and sharp, and the edge of the blue one's kind of blurry, and actually it's kind of wavy? Photoshop did its best to try and smooth out that circle, but because I had enlarged it from such a small circle, the pixels became so big, it ends up looking kind of crappy. Okay? So that's one of the number one rules in Photoshop is if it's a pixel-based layer, you cannot scale it up without losing quality. Now, you scale it up just a smidge, you might not notice it. But if you scale it up like I did from a tiny little circle to a big circle, you'll notice the quality. If that was somebody's face, say, for instance, they would look like they were out of focus now, be all blurry. You wouldn't see features very well or anything like that, okay? So if it was a photograph, it would look horrendous. So that's a really important thing to kind of understand about Photoshop. The other thing to understand about Photoshop is when you were in Illustrator, you were able to draw multiple objects on a single layer and still have control over each individual object, right? If you wanted to move a line, you could move a line, even if it was on the same layer. So I'm going to get yellow here in my color, take my paintbrush, let me get just a normal paintbrush here, and I'm just going to paint some yellow. Okay, now, notice what I did. What layer was I on? I was on the layer with the blue circle, layer number 2. It's really the third layer, but that's okay. Now, if I want to go move that yellow line, oops. I just painted over top of my blue circle, and guess what? I'm never getting these two separated again, unless I go edit undo. Well, let's say I save this, and then tomorrow I come back and I want to separate this yellow line from the blue circle. Nope, done. I'm going to have to redo both of them now, basically. Because they are on the same layer and they now have become one shape because they're pixel-based. This is not like Illustrator. So another general rule of thumb with Photoshop is one object per layer. Every time you want to do something new, you make a new layer. So here, I'll go down here. See that? Button right there, the bottom of the Layers palette. Create a new layer. Click. New layer pops up. Now, I can take my paintbrush, and I can do this. And since it's on a separate layer, I can move it, and it remains separate from the blue. Yes, question?
How come on your layers thing, I guess, like, it shows that your thing is transparent, like you're on like a solid background?
Very good, because each layer has its own transparencies. Okay, is that what you mean? Like in here, you're seeing the checkerboard?
Yeah.
Yeah, because each layer is transparent. So if I just turn off layer 1 here, watch what happens. I don't any longer have an opaque background. So each layer has its own transparency setup. See? Which is good. You don't want each layer to have an opaque background because then you wouldn't see it, you wouldn't be able to have an order to create depth in a design. And then you can have your background like this or whatever color you want it to be. But that's an excellent question. So you'll see that each layer has its own transparency in here. The checkerboard is there, and that's why that's there, is because each layer is transparent wherever you don't draw something. You'll notice, by the way, that I have a whole series of tools just like in Illustrator. So if I create a rectangle here, okay, I can go over here and I've got the convert point tool, and I can go here and I can grab points. I can make them curves, corners. There's the direct selection tool and the path selection tool here, so I can stretch them and do all sorts of stuff with them, okay? Just like in Illustrator. So there's a lot of things that are the same that you're just going to get used to. There's a text tool, but there's other things that you will have to get used to, like the brush tool is very different. In Illustrator, when you use the brush tool, right, and you painted, you could go in and you could click on the line that was part of that paintbrush, and you could adjust its shape. Remember, I showed you that? You can't do that here. When I paintbrush, it's like literally using paint and putting it right down on the paper. It's there, and you can't alter it, save, erasing it. You can erase it like you could a pencil or something like that, but you can't change the shape. Now, there is a line tool that's under here, which is really good to use, okay? So there's a line tool there. But if you just use the paintbrush, it doesn't transform it into a path like it did in Illustrator. It's pixels, solid color. So you really can't do much. You can erase it though, you know. So right here you've got an eraser. Notice that an eraser won't work. Certain tools won't work on shape layers. And click. And it gives me an error here. That shape layer must be rasterized. That's our word for pixelized, basically. Okay? That shape layer must be rasterized before proceeding, and then it will no longer have a vector mask. Rasterize the shape. Now, it's not wrong to rasterize a shape, but realize that once you do rasterize a shape, you lose the ability to scale it up and down. You also lose the ability to change the outline. So you probably don't want to do it most of the time. So hit cancel, and then it says, sorry, you can't use the eraser. But if I go to a pixel-based layer, now I can use the eraser. See? And it literally erases and makes that part of the layer transparent so you can see the layers underneath. Does that make sense to everybody? This is just kind of a general overview of the way Photoshop works. Okay? It's good to know that there are pixel-based layers and vector-based layers. There are a lot of tools that are the same, but a lot of them don't function the same way in Photoshop as they do in Illustrator. Okay, so in review, before I let you guys go and play with Photoshop for a little bit, there are a couple things you must always know about Photoshop. Number one, the resolution of the document is the ultimate resolution of that file. Because we're dealing with a pixel-based file here, even if you have vector-based objects inside the file, they are limited by the resolution of the container document. So you can set the document to be 50 pixels per inch, and you're going to have a pretty poor quality print, even though you could have the whole design could be vector-based shapes. Number two, you cannot trust the monitor to tell you exactly what the quality of your image is when you're looking at it like this, which is zoomed far away. You can't trust it because the monitor is 72 pixels per inch and your print should be at 300 pixels per inch. And finally, there are two different types, well, layers are life in Photoshop. That's our final point. And the layers can be one of two kinds of layers. They can be a pixel-based layer or they can be a shape-based layer, a vector-based layer. If it's a vector-based layer, there are certain tools that will not work on it. If it's a shape-based layer, the vector-based tools won't work on that layer. So depending upon the type of the layer that you have, tools may or may not function. You can switch a vector-based layer to a shape-based layer. However, it's very hard to switch a shape or a pixel-based layer. Did I just say vector-based to shape-based? I did. You can switch a vector-based or a shape-based layer to a pixel-based layer or rasterized layer. It's very hard, however, to switch a rasterized layer back into a shape layer. So once you've made your shape layer into a pixel-based layer, it's very difficult to go back. Not impossible, but it takes several steps that I'm not going to go over today. And lastly, every time you make a new object, you put that object on its own layer. This means that in some designs, and I am not exaggerating, you can have well over 100 layers. I'm not exaggerating, okay? And our next project that we're going to do, some people may get upwards of 40 or 50 layers easy in this next project as I start to show you how you can make layers interact with each other, but that's another demonstration. Any questions? Okay.